Whether you have an old camera or a brand new one, there's a few things you should definitely change to get the best performance.
This week we'll share our key settings that we tweak on almost every new camera. And of course, we'll share a few more stories from our time together in Australia.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Bird Photography Show with Glenn Bartley.
Hey everybody.
And me, Jan Wegener. In our last episode, we were sitting in a random hotel room in Cairns, but now Glenn's back in his kitchen in Canada, in Vancouver Island, and I'm back in my second bedroom in the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. So we're basically back to our usual places, but we had an amazing time in Australia. And I had one question for you in particular. Now you've been to Australia a few times. What is it actually like to photograph in Australia? I know a lot of people always ask me and they think it's really easy, like the birds are just climbing all over me. There's all these rifle birds displaying. What is it actually like to photograph here?
Well, if you go to the right place, that does happen. But I think that's if you can't apply that to every old bird out in the forest in Australia. Australia is a massive country, and so while you look at the field guide and there's so many spectacular birds, but they're not all everywhere. So they're spread out all around. So each region has some really highlight birds. In general, what I've noticed in Australia is it's very opportunistic type of shooting. So if there's a moment that's happening, maybe there's the right amount of rainfall somewhere, or maybe that means it's dry, or maybe that means it's wet, and there's something happening. But it's really hard to plan for those things. So I think you have to be very flexible and adaptable, and you really have to kind of grind it out and chase things and try to figure out what's working each day and make stuff happen. But it's not like all those parrots and fairy wrens and everything's just, falling out of the trees and landing on your perches for you. It's definitely not that easy.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a land where stuff happens like here, there, and everywhere. And even on this trip, we kind of tried to limit ourselves to kind of northern Australia, which is still like 3,000 miles
Massive.
or like 6,000 kilometers of range we sort of covered. And this is definitely one of the challenges as well. You see like a beautiful pink cockatoo, you see a Golden finch, and you see maybe palm cockatoo, and you think, I'm just going to go to Australia and I photograph those three and I maybe throw in a region bowerbird. But to just get those four cool species, you have to travel probably like 12,000 kilometers and do 7 airplane trips to actually get all those birds. So as you say, the size definitely makes it difficult.
Yeah, but with that said, everywhere you go, there are some really cool birds. And if you get lucky, you might be able to photograph a handful of them. And I think that was kind of the way it went on our trip. We moved around quite a bit, and obviously we have a fair bit of experience between the two of us, but we still had to work pretty hard to get those shots.
And the best example were probably those little double-eyed fig parrots we photographed. Like there was one tree we knew about where they definitely come in to feed. But for instance, I checked out the tree in I think it was early August. There was no birds at all. And then we checked it when you arrived, like late August, there were no birds at all. And then a few weeks later, after we came back from our Darwin trip, suddenly there was a few birds every morning who got some really nice photos and videos.
Yeah, and another great example, it really felt like when I first arrived, the timing just wasn't quite right in Cairns.
Yeah.
The birds weren't really singing. Even we looked around for some metallic starlings. They weren't quite really even back yet.
Cold as well.
It was kind of cold, and we went off to the north, and sort of, I guess it would be about 2 weeks later, we circled back around.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, there was way more metallic starlings. We found a fantastic colony to photograph at.
Yeah.
Those fig parrots were coming in. So just to illustrate sort of the difference of just 2 weeks can make a huge impact on your photography. And I think, when you're in the field, you have to really be tuned into what's happening, what's working, and what's not working. Because you could just keep trying for that one thing, and it's not going to happen. So you have to sort of move or try for different species.
So now we're both back home. You're almost heading off on some other trip. I'm heading off next weekend to go somewhere else as well. So we definitely don't like staying at home. But you had at least a little bit of time to reflect on the trip, go through some of the images, edit some of the images. What were some of the highlight moments that we kind of experienced together in the field? What was like a true standout besides obviously standing next to me?
Well, the rainbow pitta up in the north, up in Darwin, really stood out to me. I mean, that was a bird that I really didn't want to come home without. It's such a beautiful little pitta. I'd seen some cool shots of it. I am, more used to the pittas in South America, which are very skulky, very difficult. So it was kind of such a shock to see that guy just hopping around and just like really posing. That was fantastic. The finches were phenomenal up in the Cunnanar region where we went, and we got, it really felt, again, we had to work hard to try to find the right spot and figure out how to set up. And it actually took us a couple sessions to kind of get dialed in on what would work. And even then, it was such a brief moment. But because I think of that, it made it feel really special that we actually did, after all that, like flying over there, driving all around, we finally found the right spot and we got some good shots. So that was really cool.
And it's one of those things, right? Like while you're doing it, it feels very hard. It's very hot. You're grinding it out. You're looking for perches. Once you're actually back home and you look through some of the images and you actually get 1 or 2 or 3 really nice photos, it actually makes it a really special, real memorable experience. But while you're actually in that experience, it doesn't feel as good. But now looking back to it, it feels pretty cool.
And probably one of the worst ratios of like the number of photos taken for how many I might actually process up. It's like, it's pretty shocking. Another one that really stood out to me because it really felt like almost like I was in an episode of Planet Earth or, BBC footage, was watching those rifle birds display. So I was actually not at the place where we thought we would get them. After I came back to that region, for a second time, I was just walking around this lake and I saw one displaying, and I managed to kind of get an angle, and I just waited, and he was actually fairly active. He did some displays. Of course, he refused to display in my direction, but I still think I got like kind of a cool shot that I like. Maybe not the dream shot. In the perfect world, I would have gotten some more with him displaying towards me, but it was still cool just to see him like really holding his wings out and opening his bill, and it really felt like it's a cool display to see.
And it's just one of those moments that really gets your like adrenaline pumping as well, isn't it? Like it's just this little bird just sitting there, just looking around, not really doing anything, and suddenly it's like whoosh, and you're like, what the hell just happened? And it's just like,
it's otherworldly. Yeah, it's otherworldly to see them do that crazy display. There's nothing that I can think of like that in the Americas that does a similar type of thing. So that really feels quite unique. And then, of course, the last one, which was a bizarre experience. I guess I kind of had 2 experiences with these dinosaur birds, these cassowaries. I guess I kind of had seen your shots along the beach, and based on what what you had told me, it was kind of like the expectation was there that we would see one there.
To give people some context as well, after spending 2 or 3 weeks in the field together, we definitely had enough of each other, and we decided we do the cassowary together. And then Glenn was going to go back to Cairns and Port Douglas, spend some more time there, and I was driving back home with my family. So normally it's actually hard to get these cassowary photos, but you were almost over it after like 2 hours at the spot because the bird was just walking up and down and up and down. And so we decided to just spend only one night there, which in hindsight was probably good because otherwise we would have felt like it might be getting almost too much. But the last morning, there was a very cool experience as well. I think we walked up and down the beach together. There wasn't much going on. And then you decided you're going to have some breakfast. A few minutes later, someone was honking the horn at me. A follower of us told me that there was a bird with 2 babies up the road. And so I got some really nice photos and videos there. And they eventually made their way down to the beach. And I was texting you frantically. I'm like, come on now, come to the beach. And before there was no reception. So eventually you got to see the babies as well, but it was almost too late. But then you actually did find yourself another male with 2 babies later on, didn't you?
Yeah, I got lucky because, a few weeks later, I was up in Cape Tribulation and just driving along the main road, got lucky, and there was another male with 2 very young, even younger babies than the ones that was at that site. And it was fairly brief encounter, but I did get a few decent frames where kind of like 1 or 2 of the babies was kind of like right at the feet of the adult.
It's also quite a challenge to photograph a bird that's literally as tall as you are with a baby that's almost like smaller than a chicken. So it's very difficult to actually frame that because you have to be in a good angle where you kind of still get the parent in, but also make the baby look a decent size. So I found that very challenging. So there's a few shots
Yeah.
where I try to only get the massive feet of the parents in and then just have the baby standing along the feet. But then you do want to get the whole scene as well. But especially if you're usually in a road environment when you see them, it's kind
That's
of
the thing.
difficult to align yourself as well. Although the road's probably better than the rainforest, because if you're walking through the thick forest and you discover them with the babies, they're probably just always hidden away. So definitely a challenge, but also quite a unique experience to actually see a bird that's as tall as you are and could potentially just kick and kill you.
No, I mean, everyone's heard the stories about cassowaries. I think there has been some fatalities, and those feet have to be seen to be believed. I mean, you look at those legs and you immediately understand that if this animal wanted to do me harm, and animals have those animal instincts, like where they really go crazy if they do, and there's nothing like that. But you realize it could mess you up if it wanted to.
And it's like bigger than your arm, the legs, and the feet are much
huge.
bigger than your hands. Like it's pretty crazy.
So all in all, it was a fantastic experience with those cassowaries. And, we were both shooting with new cameras on this trip. We both were shooting with the R5 Mark II, getting to know that camera, understanding that camera, figuring out how to set up that camera. And by the way, if you're looking to set up your R5 Mark II, we've got a great setup guide for you. We can see that down in the description. But it's pretty obvious that whenever one of us buys a new camera, there's always certain settings that we always want to change pretty much on every one. Isn't that right?
Definitely. And there's certain things that when you open up a box and take the camera out, the standard settings are often not really set up in a way that work very well, in particular for nature and bird photography. It might work quite well for people, but there's certain settings we definitely want to change to make sure that we get enough out of the camera, or actually make it work in a way that it's the most beneficial to taking those photos.
So one setting that I think both of us would always change every time on a camera is, the standard out of the box is to use the shutter button to do autofocus. And I think, both of us couldn't really imagine going back to using a camera in that way. There's some serious advantages to back button autofocus. I actually didn't use back button autofocus until there were cameras that I could assign two different settings and have double back button autofocus, where I can use two different autofocus scenarios to really allow me to control the autofocus of the camera. And I cannot imagine having a camera now without double back button autofocus. What about you, Jan?
Definitely. I think I always used back button autofocus. With the DSLR cameras, I just simply used the one button on the back to focus because we only have the one focusing mode available. But with the mirrorless cameras in particular and the eye tracking autofocus that gives the camera a lot more control over what it wants to focus on, the need arose that we also need to have a second button assigned to the traditional kind of autofocus that allows us to still control the camera and make it or force it to focus on whatever we want to focus on, because the eye tracking is amazing and it allows us to take so many more great images, gives us more birds in flight opportunities. For instance, it's also much easier to compose the image in the camera, but at the same time, sometimes it just prefers a stick over the bird or the background over the bird, and in these cases you want to have another button to control.
Yeah, or sometimes it just, even though you think there's no reason why it shouldn't know what the eye is here, just the algorithm and the plumage of the bird or the shape of the eye or whatever, it just doesn't know what the eye is. And if you don't have a second button that you can assign to do the more, manual kind of one-shot autofocus, you have no options. Like your camera doesn't work anymore. So you definitely, I think with the mirrorless cameras and eye detect, you absolutely want double back button autofocus for the maximum kind of potential in the field.
And this is not just for Canon. We do the same if we shoot a Sony or a Nikon camera, even though in some camera bodies it's a little bit more difficult because of the arrangement of the buttons in the back of the camera. Nikon in particular, they have a really nice big AF on button, but then there isn't really a dedicated second back button on the back of the camera, which I find always a little bit difficult to use. So I usually assign the display button, which is a bit further over to the left for my second focusing option. But then Nikon does have 3 buttons in the front of the camera you can assign as well. But I always find it a little bit harder to press buttons in the front of the camera than on the back of the camera, because you kind of change how you hold the camera and it feels a little bit looser in your hand.
I think ergonomically, it's a lot nicer to have the autofocus for your thumb there as opposed to having to use one of the front ones. But having 3 on the front would be really nice for different other features that you might want to engage or
Definitely.
change or things like that. So I wouldn't mind on the Canon having a few more there. Like even if they just had like preset 1, preset 2, even if they left them blank out of the box and just allowed you to have some more customizability. And that's the thing. So now we're getting, we're always been getting these cameras that have specific features. So let's talk about the R5 Mark II. What was the main thing that it brought to the table, Jan?
So the biggest changes were probably that we now have up to 30 frames per second available. And of course, we also have now pre-shooting or pre-capture or whatever you want to call it available.
Yeah.
But the thing with these two elements in particular is that you want to find ways to turn these on and off rather quickly. Because especially with the pre-capture, you probably don't want to have it on all the time if you know that you don't need it, because you get 15 extra photos every time. And when it comes
to this, really like culling. Like if you love culling, go ahead, leave it on all the time.
I mean, it can sometimes help you to get a shot that you would have otherwise missed, but in a lot of cases, I feel like turning it on and off makes a lot of sense.
Ultimately, like we kind of set ours up very similar but slightly different little things. I think both of us have the front button to access into the menu and to start at the green menu, where we've specifically put our most used settings, including pre-capture right at the top, and then anything else that you might want to access, such as the drive mode, so you could change from 20 frames to 30 frames. As you use your camera, you figure out how you want to enable custom buttons, and every camera will be different and every user is different. There's no one perfect way to do it, but it's important that the most important functionality of the camera, the key features that you want to use, you can change them quickly. Okay, so let's go through a few other things that we usually change. Just one of the things is sometimes cameras get a little confused about what card they're recording to, and it can get a little annoying. You take this card out and it automatically goes to the other one, or things like that. And especially on a camera that doesn't have 2 CF Express cards, you don't really want to go back out into the field and it's recording to the SD card, especially like I usually have the SD card just for video, so it can get a bit annoying. But very often there's a way to assign priority to one of the cards, and I would recommend that you assign that to the CF Express card.
Definitely, and sometimes that is hidden away a fair bit. For instance, if you go into the R5 Mark II's menu, it's not very obvious. You actually have to go into the yellow menu where you can assign the different functions to the card, and then at the very bottom there is just a little thing that says if you press here, then it will prioritize the CF Express card. So in certain other cameras this is done a little bit better and the priority is easier to figure out, but oftentimes, especially in the high-end cameras, there is at least a way to assign the priority to the CF Express card, because I think we've all been there in the field. You take out the CF Express card, you put it back in, you start taking pictures, you think the camera's broken because it's just buffering the whole time until you realize, oh, I'm stuck on the SD card. So changing that over is definitely a good one.
Yeah. Now here's another one that I would always put on any camera that I would use, and I honestly think it would be very strange to not do this, is to enable the highlight alert. When you're looking at an image and you're playing back an image, I definitely want a very clear visual reminder that those highlights are blown so that I can make the necessary changes. So I would always enable the highlight alert, or whatever it happens to be called on your camera.
And there's another one that all the modern cameras have as well that is insanely annoying unless you're using a very certain kind of lens, and that is the standard function that the camera defocuses to infinity, I think, every time it goes into standby or when you turn it off. And that was definitely driving me crazy until I figured out, until a very cryptic wording in the menu, you could actually turn this on and off. On Canon, for instance, it's called retract lens on power off. Like, no one would ever think that that's actually what makes the camera defocus. But because there's certain lenses that sometimes protrude out when you focus, and then if you turn this off, these lenses will not defocus into their like protected position. So you could potentially break a lens like a 35mm 1.8 lens. But for most other people, turning this off is very important, because then the camera will stay focused on what you have focused. And you have the same for Sony and Nikon as well.
And maybe we'll do one more here, and this might be a little bit specific to some of the Canon cameras. I'm not totally familiar with the Nikon and Sony ones as much, but with the R5 Mark II, for sure, there's the little red record button there. And you definitely want to set up a custom function 3 to use that, so that anytime something's happening and you want to shoot a little video, you can just hit that and you kind of know more or less what video mode you're going to be in.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the best features you get on Canon from the R5 and up. And no other brand really has that either. Normally, if you press the record button from photo mode, it either doesn't work at all, or it records in some strange automatic mode and is completely useless. So normally on most other brands, you actually have to switch from photo to video to be able to record proper video. Whereas on Canon, on the R5, on the R5 Mark II, on the R3, and I'm sure on the R1 as well, you press the red record button on top of the camera, and regardless what mode you're in, it will start filming in whatever settings you've dialed in as custom function 3. And this is super helpful in the field. As you say, you can quickly press the button. You don't even have to switch from photo to video or do anything. It will instantly record in those settings. And as you say, it's important usually at the start of the shoot to dial in good looking settings. So then throughout the shoot, you can simply press that red record button on and off and it will record. And as you say as well, it makes sense to set up the custom functions to automatically update every time you make a change. So if you switch back to photo and go back to video, you already have the good settings dialed in.
So we've got our R5 Mark IIs dialed in now how we want them. And if you've picked up a new R5 Mark II and you want to get it dialed in, be sure to check up that settings guide down in the description, because we've done all the hard work so you don't have to.
And if you don't have that camera, there's also a few high ISO files that you might want to check out to see if it's a camera that you might actually want to use. And we share some of the images that we've taken on that trip for you to check out and pixel peep and edit them whichever way you want to.
All right, I think we've talked enough about settings, cameras. Why don't we take a look at some of the beautiful photos that we were able to capture in Australia, and then share some of the challenges when it comes to editing them, especially some of those really vibrant, colorful birds.
Definitely, there is some very vibrant birds around here, and I think that's what makes a lot of birds in Australia unique. There's a few very brightly colored birds, like a red-winged parrot, for instance, a lime green bird with a blue sort of back, red wings, and it's just very difficult to edit some of these colors sometimes. Or you have some of the Goldian finches that may not have had the best plumage, and you might need to color in some dull feathers. So there's definitely some challenges when it comes to editing, because either the birds may not be colorful enough, or in the case of the red-winged parrots, they're so colorful that you're basically clipping your histogram on both sides because it's just too oversaturated.
Now, this is one of the main reasons why we made our brush pack, for example. Obviously, you can do things globally, you can do things with masks, things like that. But sometimes the easiest way is to sort of go through your edit, do your normal kind of basic workflow, work your way through your steps. And then at the end, you can kind of identify like, okay, it's missing some, the wing is red, but you can see that maybe it's losing some pigment and some of the feathers. And it's a lot easier to just go in there, for example, with our add color to dull feathers brush and just brush in some color. And that's the color that would have been there, but maybe the bird's just kind of molting a little bit or something like that. Same thing like I found on those red-winged parrots, that just the back, it seemed to me like it should be kind of darker and more contrasty, some of the darker plumage. And it was really easy to just simply load up our add mid-tone contrast or darken area, and then make a selection of the bird and refine that edge, and then easily just go in and paint some of that area a little bit darker, just to give it that contrast that it truly did have in the field. Like if you look at the bird with your eyes, that's what it looks like. But just in the editing process, and just maybe that individual wasn't in like prime plumage. So those are the kind of things I think that can really elevate your images when you take that last final step and you kind of identify any kind of color imbalances, like if there's a blue cast to something, if something needs to be darker, if something needs to be more or less saturated. And then let's be honest, sometimes we photograph birds that are missing feathers, or that the plumage should be brighter and it's just not on the individual that you photographed. And so we've given you some great brushes in our brush pack to deal with those.
And if you have a bird that's very oversaturated, like a red-winged parrot or even the little fig parrots, where the green is usually oversaturated, the red in the face is oversaturated, my favorite trick is usually that I go in and I do a hue saturation adjustment layer, and I pull down the saturation to the point that it looks too dull, but I take out the oversaturation out of the area that I want to work on, and that gives me more detail in those areas. So then I hide that layer, I brush it into those areas, but then at that same time, now the area will look way too washed out, doesn't look quite right anymore. So what I like to do then is I go to my adjustment layers and I go to selective color. And I go to the color channel that I want to change or that I desaturated with the hue saturation. And for instance, let's say it's the red wing of the red-winged parrot. I pulled back the saturation, but now it looks too washed out. Now I can go to the selective color, go to the red channel, and then I simply put in a bit more red and a bit more blacks. And that brings back the bite and the color into the area without having the oversaturation in there. And if you guys want to learn all about image editing, make sure to check out my brand new Next Generation Photoshop Masterclass, my Lightroom Masterclass, Glenn's ebooks, our PROSETS, our brush pack, and our camera guides. And I know that will help you a lot to set up your gear and also get the images in the editing process that you've always dreamed of.
All right, well, why don't we check and see if some of you guys edited your photos properly? Because I think it's time for the photo of the week.
So the first image I brought this week, fitting to this episode, is a rainbow pitter by Birding with Simon. And I thought it's a really nice image, and actually one I found somewhat difficult to get into the field myself, because it's one of those birds where you need a very specific pose to see all the features on the bird. Like you want to see the red sort of bum, you want to see the nice blue shoulder patch, you want to see part of the black chest, you want to see the green back, and you want to see the crown on the back of the head. And I think in this case, he did a perfect job of getting a really nice pose of the bird. And there's also very nice detail in the bird overall with quite a pleasing background as well.
I think the pose of the bird's really nice in this case, and it's edited overall fairly well. Like the bird looks really good. I guess my only concern or my only kind of, complaint about this image is it's just not the most appealing setting, in my opinion. I don't mind the bird being on the ground, but I would prefer to have it in some leaf litter or something just a little more indicative of the habitat, or up on some kind of a little log or a little root or something like that. That just gives it a little something, because, the perch is a big part of the image, and as is the background. And I think, in this case, it's like a really beautiful bird, but it just doesn't have that other element going on.
Yeah, I definitely like the colors and the light in the shot. The ground, whatever it's standing on, I'm not sure if it's a log or the ground, could definitely be slightly nicer, but it's not the easiest to get that bird on there. But looking at it now, there's also a somewhat interesting sort of transition from the foreground to the background. So I don't know if that was sort of blended in a little bit, but overall, I think it's a very nice image with a fantastic pose and some really good editing on the bird.
All right, so for my first image this week, I brought this kind of cool shot. I thought it was cool. By Mark Humphreys Photography, and it's of, I would imagine, an Atlantic puffin, and it's very, black and white, monochrome kind of image with the bird silhouetted on the highlighted area from the sun. I just thought it was a cool way to present this, because obviously it was shot during the day, and yet it makes it look like it's at night. I'm assuming it was shot during the day. And
yeah, for sure.
Overall, I just think it just looks really cool. Like it's an interesting image to look at to me. It almost makes it seem like it's night, even though it's not. But it does look really interesting.
It's definitely an interesting shot. I assume it was taken sort of somewhat later in the afternoon, where you get that crazy reflection on the ocean, where it's normally impossible to photograph. So this was probably a good idea to underexpose like crazy to get that kind of shot, and then probably lighten up the sky again a bit. So that's definitely an interesting photo. My next image is of this really cool, I think it's called a city. And it's just a crazy looking bird that almost looks like an AI bird, to be honest, because you feel like all these features don't really fit together. It's a beautiful image of a crazy looking bird, so I'd love to photograph that bird one day, but there's obviously a couple things that could be improved here to make the bird stand out even more.
Yeah, I think I'm jealous, just to have an opportunity to go to Madagascar and photograph these unbelievable birds. I'm definitely jealous. The overall white balance and image looks a little bit cool to me. I don't know if that's one of the things you were going for. The eye kind of patch maybe is just a little hot. Like maybe you could work on controlling the brightness and therefore probably have a little more color in that. I would imagine that that's what you would see again, like if you were in the field looking with binoculars. I'm pretty sure you'd probably see more color in that weird like facial skin. But this is one of those examples where probably the photographer, when they were editing the image, they sort of were working on whether they were using curves or levels, and they brightened up the image. And then all of a sudden that started to get blown out. So they stopped, and then they, pushed it as far as they could. But in doing so, it just stayed a bit too bright. So just some more selective editing just to maybe darken that up and get a little more color in that eye patch. And then maybe it's just a little cool.
And see, this is where the Nik collection and the detail extractor works really well as well. Like it's a plugin for Photoshop and Lightroom. And here you could actually go in and it helps you to bring a lot more detail into a bright area like this. And there's also a few test versions and a special discount code for you linked down there in the description. But this is something that I use in a lot of cases. For instance, also on the red wing parrot, when the wing is too red, you can actually bring in a lot more nice detail. So that's definitely something I use a lot.
Overall, really cool bird, and it's a nice photo. It's on a nice little perch. It's in a very natural kind of setting, which I like. Just there's a few little things in the background I might kind of work on and just polish it up a little more. But overall, a really cool shot.
Yeah, so for me, it was definitely the little bit too bright eyebrow I was thinking. And then I thought the background, that very dark line was a bit too kind of dominant for me behind the bird. So I might just brush in a little bit of color or clone in there at a little low opacity. And this gives me a bit more of a smoother, little bit brighter background. So you don't have that very dark line right behind the bird.
All right, my second image this week is of this really cool gray-headed kingfisher, and I just thought this is just a fantastic moment. The bird's just probably landed on the perch, or it's maybe displaying to another bird, and it's got this crazy-looking insect, big grasshopper or something. It's just got all these like fun elements. The wings up with the prey item. The perch is a little horizontal, but it does have that little bend in it, so that's pretty cool. Nice background. Just all in all, a really nice image. You could probably pop up some of the colors on the wing and maybe add a bit of contrast here and there, but overall a really nice image.
Yeah, I actually had a very similar moment with a sacred kingfisher where it suddenly ripped up the wings as well, but it's actually because it had a soldier crab in its beak and it kind of lost it. So it was falling down, it grabbed it, and then when it threw it back up, it ripped up the wings as well. So that might be what's going on here as well, especially with this hard shell praise. It seems like they struggle with it for a little while, and then sometimes to balance themselves out, they rip up the wings. So that may have happened here. Overall, I agree the editing is pretty good, but I think it could definitely use a curves and level adjustment to just make it a little bit brighter with a little bit more sort of popping colors and just making it all stand out a little bit more. But overall, very nice. My last image is of a bee-eater. I don't know the species exactly. If you do, let us know in the comments. But I thought it was a very interesting image because technically it's actually nice, but at the same time it also shows one of the flaws that a lot of, especially the earlier mirrorless models have. If I had to guess, I'd think this was probably taken with a Sony a7 III or something like that, but correct me if I'm wrong. But overall, the image is actually very nice. We have good light, we have a good background, we have a nice banking pose. Of course, in an ideal world, you might want the bird to look at you, but it's still a very nice image. But what's the one thing that stands out to you?
Yeah, I think we're into this era now where you see a lot of these images. I've seen some in contests, even like contest winning photos and stuff. But to me, this image is a perfect example of what is rolling shutter. So in this case, the camera sensor is taking the image off the sensor from the top down, and by the time it gets this wing like this, but by the time it starts to record the front wing's already moved here, even though it should be back here. And so you see this very obvious kind of bent wings. This is not real. This bird would never fly like this. You would never in a single instant see these two wings like that. This is an artifact of rolling shutter. And to me personally, I'm not a fan of images that they can look kind of weird and kind of cool. It can look interesting in a photo. It can visually.
Here it does look like it's kind of flying like crazy, but as you say, the slow readout speed is really what gives us this image.
Yeah, it's a digital artifact of the limitation of the camera. And as a result, for me, I would personally not keep or present this image because it shows too much rolling shutter. Now that's a personal choice. Obviously, if you think it looks cool, go for it. But I just think this,
as you say, there were competition winners that have basically exactly the same effect. So what do we know? But I agree that this is sort of something because it can never happen like that. And
No.
that's what makes it a little bit difficult for me.
Yeah, yeah. So it's up to the individual user, but it's what's important and why we're mentioning it, why we use this photo this week, is just to show people what is rolling shutter.
Yeah.
And when you get those images, just to think about that. Like, do you want to present that image and maintain that, or do you think, oh, shoot, that's a limitation of my camera?
Or when you look at this image, you think, wow, I want to capture a bird with the wings in two different directions. But you have to realize that that is actually impossible unless you buy one of those slow readout cameras.
Yeah. All right, so my last image this week is by Prasheen Gopal, and it's of this Cape sugarbird. I think this is such a cool bird. I really love the perch. In fact, I like almost everything about this image. There's one little thing, Jan. What do you think I might be talking about? That just, if it was me, I might get out my clone brush and maybe do a few things.
Yeah, first of all, it's a really cool image, edited fairly well as well. Maybe a little bit cool, you could warm that up a little bit, but overall, cool bird, very hard to frame with that monstrous long tail. So they were lucky that Perch actually allowed it to frame it like that. But then there's one issue that could be solved in two different ways, I think. I think the main thing here is the beak overlapping with that one leaf that just takes away from it a little bit. So option one would be to simply clone out that one leaf or the two leaves that are kind of right in line where that beak is. The other option, if you don't mind going in a little bit more aggressive, a little bit harder, would be to take out the whole top of that bit of green on the right hand side and lower it a little bit below the bird's head to make the bird stand out even more. But that would be a lot more altering the image. So I think for most people, option one is probably the best one, but lowering the whole green on the right hand side could also help so it doesn't feel like the bird's directly staring into that plant.
Yeah, and I think so. The issue here, forget about like what tools you would use or how far you'd go with the cloning, but the issue is that there's a bright thing intersecting the bird's beak, right?
Yeah.
So that's going to be visually. It's like if you have a bright stick coming through the back of the bird's head or going through the bill, it's something you're always going to at least want to think about whether you want to do something about that. And then you think, okay, what could I do about that? So as you say, the easiest thing would be to just take out that one or the two little leaves there.
Yeah.
Another option, and I'm not sure if this is what you meant, is so for example, you could, make a little incision next to the bird's bill to create a distance there, and then go down to just where that flower bud is there and actually remove that entire leafy part. So just leaving the
That's what I meant
what
with the green thing on the right hand side. I thought you didn't even have to go down to the flower bud, but now that you said it, that's probably even better. Because
That's
then
the
you'd
easiest.
have a truly stunning image where the bird looks out to the right and there's nothing right in the bird's view where it feels like the bird's kind of looking into a wall. It's obviously altering the image more, but I think we're thinking both the same thing, that green branch on the right, that is kind of nice, but at the same time probably takes away from the image because it's almost more dominant than the bird and a bit taller than the bird.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and this is again where it's up to each person how much you want to go. The way I look at this is, it's still totally natural. The bird landed there. He's on the flower. He's feeding from the flower, and it's a beautiful perch. It's just that aesthetically, it's not balanced because of that big leafy part that's sticking up there, and it actually is very easy to remove that. If nothing else, if it was me, I would do the removal and just do it as a separate layer, and then just play with it on and off, and then you decide like, truly, which do I like better? And then that's the one I would go with.
And I think this would be a good example where kind of two worlds collide, right? The one world is where you want to keep it as natural as possible and maybe even cleaning out the little leaf behind the beak is already too much. Or the other world, I think where we often kind of reside, is where you want to get the best possible image. And if there was a little thing in the way, like a little branch or a missing feather, that's still fine to us to remove that to get a much better, a much stronger image that essentially still shows the same scene, but in a optimized way, so to speak.
Yeah, I think for me, usually where I land on that kind of spectrum of processing is, is it still what I saw? Like if I was just with binoculars, yes, you saw this bird, you saw this flower. It's just that you can imagine a world where that leaf just didn't grow and it's still totally natural. It still was captured in one frame, but it just needs a little bit of aesthetic improvement to make it a truly standout photo that meets all of our kind of compositional requirements and all those things.
And obviously this can be a little bit controversial, so let us know your opinion down there in the comments as well.
All right, everybody, I think we've covered a lot of topics this week. We've talked about a lot of things. Be sure to like the video, give Jan a subscription here, and let us know your thoughts on cloning, on things that you change every camera you get, and let us know if you enjoyed the show.
And we will see you in another video very soon. Bye.
See you next time, everybody.